visits, then it gives me great pleasure to welcome Rosemary, our speaker this evening. I won't steal much of her thunder. From what I've read about Rosemary's story, there are sort of similarities to a program which has been on TV over the last couple of weeks with Judge Rob Rinder, who's done a similar sort of story there. I did actually approach him to see if he'd be interested in coming along tonight to actually watch Rosemary talk. He did come back to me. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us, but he did wish Rosemary well with her talk and also with books she's got out to accompany the talk. So, which is quite nice. So, Rosemary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Darren, and thank you all for coming along and for inviting me to speak tonight. I will be giving a talk based on my book, which I wrote a couple of years ago. Now it came out. It's called Finding RELLY, My Family, the Holocaust and Me. And that was 2 years before Judge Rinder had the title, My Family, the Holocaust and Me as well. But I'm going to start screen sharing now, if that's okay.
Yep,
Darren.
you should be able to.
This is...
So the green button down the bottom of the screen, that's it, yep.
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Right. My father, there will be chance for questions afterwards, by the way. And when I go along, if I mention something that you're not familiar with, because there's so much sort of information to do with the Holocaust and names of places and everything. Not everybody knows everything. I don't know everything. If anyone doesn't know what I'm referring to, please just put your hand up and I'll stop and explain what it is. But I'll start with introducing these people that you can see. This is RELLY, who I traced, and Moritz. Now, Moritz was my father's brother. They were Czech. My father was a Czechoslovakian refugee who managed to get to this country in 1939. Moritz and RELLY were also Czech. They didn't get out. They spent 2.5 years in Theresienstadt. Now, is there anyone who doesn't know what Theresienstadt or Terezin is? I can't see everyone, that's the trouble. Was there a hand up? Yes, okay. Theresienstadt, to try and describe very briefly, was a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. It was not an extermination camp. It was a transit camp, so to speak, but there were many deaths. There were about 30,000 deaths at that camp. But they had, that's where nearly all the Czechs went through. Other nationalities, other countries, also Jews went through Theresienstadt on their way, often went through there on their way to an extermination camp. And it's worth looking into, actually, because it was used as a propaganda coup by the Nazis when they invited the Red Cross to come and inspect it once, and they staged everything. So it looked okay. And the Red Cross was fooled. But yes, like I say, it's worth looking up. A lot went on in there as well. But most Jews who went there didn't come out. Moritz was a doctor. He was married to RELLY, and he actually worked as a doctor for 2.5 years in Theresienstadt before they were transported to on the penultimate transport to Auschwitz, where Moritz was killed immediately. Apparently, RELLY found out afterwards that he had actually stood up to Mengele, and that sealed his fate. He was murdered pretty well immediately. RELLY was lucky. She spent 9 days in Auschwitz and then was sent to work as slave labor in a munitions factory for 6 months. And because this is now getting towards the end of the war, they were sent to Auschwitz in 1944. She was eventually liberated, and she was liberated back in Theresienstadt. She ended up back there and found out that Moritz hadn't survived. Now, my father, like I say, he got out. He was lucky. His eldest sister had managed to get to England in 1938. She married an Englishman in Czechoslovakia and came to live in England. And my father was a civil engineer, and so she was able to get him work. When he got to England, he worked for the RAF, going around the country setting up airstrips for the RAF. And his younger sister got out as well. She got a job as a domestic. Moritz, who was a doctor, the British Medical Association would not allow refugee doctors to practice medicine in this country. So he was unable to get work. He was a very gifted artist. My father tried to get him a job as a graphic artist. Moritz did a special course. Anyway, it was all too late. And also my father's youngest brother, Egan, didn't get out. Now, the last time he saw Egan was in a passport queue, because my father had been going every day. This is in 1939. And there was a frantic rush to get out. It's probably important to explain now that the Holocaust arrived differently in Czechoslovakia than it did in Germany and Austria, because in Germany you had Hitler in 1933 being democratically elected. And so between then and the final solution, there was this incremental persecution and murdering and ill treatment of Jews, starting officially in 1933. In 1935, there were the Nuremberg laws, which again, they were all things like wearing the yellow star. Jews couldn't go to the cinema, they couldn't walk on the pavement, they couldn't go to parks, they couldn't buy chocolate, etc., etc., etc. This incremental destruction of Jewish communities and Jewish people. That happened over years, whereas in Czechoslovakia, it happened like that because, in fact, it was quite a liberal country at that time. There were a lot of Jews who'd assimilated into different communities, secular Jews. My father's family lived in towards the northeast of Czechoslovakia, or I should say, sorry, the Czech Republic. Then it was sort of more in the middle. And there were, in a city called Moravska Ostrava, which was part of a bigger city called Ostrava, there were something like 10% of the population was Jewish. It was thriving. Everyone got along, as they had done in Germany before everyone was told to hate their neighbor and hate Jews. So it was okay. And then suddenly, as I think probably all of you know, Neville Chamberlain, the English prime minister at the time, kind of sold Czechoslovakia down the river, made a deal with Hitler, peace in our time, came back waving that peace agreement, saying, oh, Czechoslovakia is just a small country we don't know very much about. And Hitler can have that, but he's promised not to invade Poland, which we all know was rubbish. So of course Hitler did invade Poland, but at that time it meant the German troops went in immediately. So things changed very, very, very fast. And for example, in Ostrava, there were 6 synagogues. They were gone in 3 months. Everything happened very, very fast. So there was a frantic rush to get out. And my father went to the passport office every day to try and join the queue, trying to get his passport with his visa stamped to get to England. And one day, at 5 minutes to closing time, he got to the counter and the passport clerk said, sorry, you're too late. And my father cajoled him, and the passport clerk said, okay, and pointed to a cupboard behind him that was full, packed with passports, said, if you can find your passport within 5 minutes, the next 5 minutes, you can have it. But because my father had been coming every day, another passport clerk overheard this conversation with my father, and he'd actually come across my father's passport that day and put it aside because he knew my father was coming in every day. He gave my father his passport. On the way out, my father passed his youngest brother, Egan, in the queue, and Egan never got out. And I'd like to mention at this point as well that there are 2 members of my father's immediate family, his youngest brother, Egan, and his father. There are no records of what happened to them. It kind of, you think the figure 6 million, it probably was a lot more than that. So my father managed to get out. He came to England, started working for the RAF at one airbase, Dunkeswell. He met my mother, who was working there as a secretary. They married in 1942, and my eldest brother was born in 1943. And the plan was always to go back to Czechoslovakia at the end of the war. And so during this time, my father talked to my mother about his family, and my mother learned Czech as well. Come the end of the war, my father was on the first plane load of Czechs back to Czechoslovakia. He managed to find RELLY in and amongst the returning refugees and survivors, and she was able to give him the terrible news. Naturally, he was devastated, but the plan remained in place that my mother and eldest brother would join my father in Czechoslovakia once he'd established himself. So he was there for a year. He got a job. He got a flat in Prague, and then there'd been a power sharing post-war government in Czechoslovakia, and that collapsed, and the communists seized power and started persecuting anyone who had any Western connections. For example, my mother's Czech teacher in England, he'd also been a refugee. He'd run a correspondence course in England, and as soon as the war ended, he also went back to Czechoslovakia. He was executed. So it was very, very dangerous for Czechs who'd had any connections with the West at that time. And they also couldn't leave. I think some were allowed to go to Israel, but other than that, they couldn't leave. So my father managed to communicate to my mother just in time. She said the furniture was already packed. It was just about to be sent. But he managed to communicate with her and said, I can't get out. Don't come. Write to me asking for a divorce, which she did. And obviously, my guess is it was in Czech because she could speak Czech. So my father went to the authorities with the letter saying, my wife is in England with my son. She's divorcing me. I have to go to England to get my son back. And they said, okay. So he got back to England, where they were immediately, both my mother and my father were served deportation notices because women lost their citizenship when they married a foreigner in those days. So they were served with deportation orders, but my mother's father appealed to the Home Secretary, saying that his only other child and his only son had been killed at the fall of Singapore, and he couldn't bear to lose his one remaining child. So they stayed. I think, I don't know how long my father kept in touch with RELLY. We moved to Wales, they moved to Wales, where I was born. Then we emigrated to Canada just before I was 6, because there were so many opportunities for engineers in Canada at that time. So my father lost touch with RELLY. You have to remember at that time there was under communism, the communication was almost impossible, let alone, there was no internet. Phone calls were almost impossible and very expensive. You had to book in advance. So it wasn't easy to keep in touch with people, and they lost touch. And my parents, my father could no longer talk about his family. It was too painful. So the stories that I grew up with were the ones that my mother relayed, the ones that he had told her. They had also decided, both of them, to protect the children, to conceal the fact that he was Jewish. So I always knew about the Holocaust, and my father was a lovely man. He was not bitter. He was extraordinary. He just could not talk about his family. And I knew about the Holocaust, and as my 2 brothers and I, we knew what had happened to his family, or we knew they'd been killed in the Holocaust, but it was explained to us in a different way. The Nazis also had a genocidal policy against Slavs, and the Czech resistance assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, who was the Reichsprotector in Czechoslovakia, the most feared man after Hitler, apparently, and the Czech resistance assassinated him. And so in retaliation, as they did, They massacred 3,000 Slavs, and they annihilated a village called Lidice, which is quite, well, the name is quite well known, and other towns around the world have been named after it. They surrounded Lidice and they massacred every living thing in that village, animals as well. And so that's how it was explained to us, that my father's family had been caught up in the wake of the Heydrich assassination, and that they thought his youngest brother had been involved with the resistance. So we grew up not knowing our father had been Jewish. So at some point after he died, he died when I was 32. It started to feel important to me to try and find out more about what had happened to his family. I did try to ask him once before he died, about two years before he died, and he did tell me that story about the passport and the last time he saw his youngest brother. But he told the story very, very slowly, and at one point he said, you know, it's taken me a long time to tell you this, because he said, because I don't want to remember. So I never asked him anything again. I didn't want to cause him any pain. But to cut now a very long story short, I think, which is why I've written a book about it, I embarked on a search to see whether RELLY might still be alive. I had no idea. I didn't know where in the world she was, if she was still alive. I just knew that she was the one who, in the whole story, that had survived, and I wanted to find out. This was in somewhere Australia. That must have been in the stories my mother had told. I don't know how. I can't remember that clearly, but that was one of the countries that I started sending search notices to. I sent search notices to Israel, the States, and Australia. Again, this is before, I started doing this in about 1995, 96. And this is before the internet, before email. So everything was done by letter or by phone. And nothing. So I went to the Wiener Library in London, which is the National Holocaust Archive, to try and find names of as many organizations as I could. Wrote off loads of letters and waited. And none of those letters, none of the organizations that I wrote to bore any fruit at all. In fact, I got one response from an organization in Israel that said that Moritz and RELLY had never even been in Theresienstadt. Well, that was wrong. And again, it was, the information started coming out after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And that was only in 1991. A lot of information was held behind the Iron Curtain, and it's still coming out now. People are still discovering things. Information is still just coming through. So sometimes you'd get an answer about something that was wrong. Next time you inquired, you'd get a different answer. It was a bit chaotic. But luckily for me, in Australia, one of the organizations that I sent the book, or the search notice to, had the sense to place it in a new publication, which I didn't know about. And it had just started up for descendants, Jewish people in Australia who are interested in their genealogy. Australia had the second highest number of Holocaust survivors after the war to Israel. So a lot of survivors there, and a lot of second generation people like me were beginning to want to delve a little deeper. And there was a new publication for this called The Kosher Koala. And someone in one of these organizations had the sense to place my search notice in The Kosher Koala. And fortunately for me, RELLY's daughter-in-law, Evelyn, was just beginning. She was also second generation. Her parents had been refugees and her grandparents had been murdered. She picked up a copy of The Kosher Koala and realized that there was somebody looking for her mother-in-law. And I'll just now show you, oh no, I'll wait a sec for that picture of RELLY. But they welcomed me into her family. I was very, very lucky. And between the year 2000, in 1998, I finally found her. Between the year 2000 and her death in 2010, I visited her and her family 5 times in Australia. She was able to tell me lots more about my father's family, about her life. Of course, she was the most wonderful woman. I will just just show a picture now. Oh, sorry. There, wrong one. There. That is really more or less at the time that I located her. And I mean, she just oozes goodness and warmth and love. She was the most amazing woman. I feel very, very blessed to have found her, and that very blessed that she embraced me as her long lost niece. So that's really what the book is about. It's about all the journey in trying to find her. Here is Relly and I in a heat wave in Sydney. This is us having a chat. And yeah, she was just wonderful. Yes, let's go back to that again. She was not bitter either. I mean, my father was not bitter at all. I wanted to, I missed that out. I'm just going to go back to this one, just as an example of, I think both of them, my father and Relly, kind of spirit they had. Some of you might have heard of Irma Gries, who was a concentration camp guard, and one of the most brutal of all. And I remember when I was quite small, still about 12, my father showing me a picture of her in a book he was reading. And she was sitting at her desk with a lamp with a shade made of human skin, because this was a kind of luxury item for the Nazis to have a lamp made of human skin. And she was sitting at the desk with this lamp, and my father just showed me the picture and said, you know, all I can feel for her now is pity, which I just think is extraordinary from someone who suffered so much. And the same as Relly, they just didn't have a bitter bone in their body. I don't know how. I wish I could say, I wish I could be like that myself. So that's it really. Oh yes, one more picture. I want to show, this is my grandmother, and I'm showing it to you for two reasons. One is to illustrate the point of how information is still just coming through. I had no pictures of my father's family at all. He fled in a rush. He had one suitcase. He didn't have time to bring the family photo album or anything. Relly sent me that wedding picture of her and Moritz. I'd never seen a picture of Moritz before. I still have no idea what Egan looks like, or my grandfather. But in 2017, an archivist in Theresienstadt came across this picture, who I'd been working with actually. She'd been very helpful. She's Czech. She just happened to be in Theresienstadt that day. She's a Czech archivist who's helped many people like me find out details like addresses, where people lived, more detail about their lives. And she came across this picture of my grandmother in the archives of Theresienstadt in 2017. You know, it's 3 years ago, and that's the first picture I've ever seen of her. She tried to get out. She tried to escape. Oh, she was thwarted at every turn. My father, I know, was trying to send her money back to try and get her out. And I just find this picture extraordinary. She knew what was coming. You know, she was in Theresienstadt, and she was didn't take long before she was sent to Treblinka, which was a an extermination camp where they had developed, these wonderful engineers had developed gas chambers that could kill 5,000 people every 20 minutes. You know, industrial genocide, and that's where she was murdered. But I look at that picture and I see different things in it sometimes. It's like, you know, dignified defeat, terrible sadness, simmering anger, defiance. That's all there, I think. An extraordinary picture. Okay. So now I'm going on to the next bit, which is, I do give talks in schools, and other second generation people as well. We are very concerned that it doesn't happen again, but we also want to try and look more closely at how such a thing happened. You know, Hitler was democratically elected. It was arguably, Germany was arguably the most sophisticated culturally, scientifically as well in Western Europe at that time. How did something like this happen there? Which is the million-dollar question. And one of the things that I feel very strongly is it's propaganda, and how effective propaganda can be and is. You hear stories from survivors who were children at the time in schools living in Germany, and how from one day to the next, their friends were no longer their friends. They hated them. They were suddenly dirty Jews. They were, you know, it's like neighbors just turning on their neighbors that they got on perfectly well with. It happens very, very fast. And so I try and look at some of the propaganda techniques. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Yeah, this will probably take about 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, thanks, Darren. Right. Well, and I do give talks in schools as well. And I start with this slide, because Nazis are often depicted, well, you see them in their jackboots and their uniforms. And it's important to understand these were ordinary people. They weren't monsters. They were people behaving like monsters. And Hannah Arendt, I don't know whether any of you have heard of her. She was a German philosopher and journalist. She covered the Eichmann trial. She came up with this expression, the banality of evil. You know, that evil can be going on when everything else just looks perfectly normal, appears perfectly normal. Appearances are deceptive. And one thing I do with young people is sort of show, you know, show them these terrible people, these evil people, being nice, being, you know, smiling, having a nice time, being nice to children, Hitler like dogs, you know. And then, of course, and there he is with Goebbels. Oh, sorry, there's Goebbels, his propaganda minister, and there as well, Goebbels, family man, all his 6 children, and then say, of course, at the end of the war, when he realized they'd lost, he killed them all, he murdered them all. So you wouldn't know that by looking at them. So appearances are deceptive, and atrocities go on behind often the guise of normality. Right. Now, this might end up being a little controversial, I'm not sure, but to me, it sort of makes the point. You've got, okay, how do you manipulate people in that way? And the Nazis were experts. You know, they wrote the propaganda book, I think, actually, and this was one of them. You know, sorry, I just moved my screen there. The efficiency of the truly national leader consists primarily in preventing the division of the attention of a people and always concentrating it on a single enemy. Well, of course, in that instance, it was the Jews. Then you have, oh, gone the wrong way, sorry. There we go. Then you've got Goebbels saying, think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play. So they have the press, you know, under their thumb as well. So you get one enemy, you get the press, and then you can see that kind of thing applied in recent history here, where we had for about, I don't know, years before the referendum, probably starting in about 2012 or more, relentless front page headlines of, you know, anti-migrants, migrants. Very effective, you know, and tremendous amount of xenophobia was whipped up using that technique. So we need to be careful. It's like it's not that long ago, really. The Holocaust is still within living memory, just about. And the techniques, it's not saying that, you know, every nation has an army of Nazis waiting to spring out. It's more about looking at how hate can be fostered and stimulated if we're not vigilant. It happens so easily. Another one, this is almost, some of you might remember when, after the referendum, where the judges, you know, intervened. Well, they're there to sort of try and stop, you know, excesses of governments, you know, going beyond their remit. Enemies of the people, you might remember that, some of you. Well, it's almost verbatim. That's a headline from a 1933 newspaper in Germany. And it's the same thing, showing the judges, naming the judges, and calling them enemies of the people, and saying they're getting in the way of the people's will. So I found that very shocking as well. Another one about, you know, repeating a lie. Well, I don't know whether any of you heard Barack Obama on Radio 4 this morning talking. He was being interviewed, which was wonderful. And he's adopted a term from a research foundation in the States called truth decay. And that's what we're suffering from now. And that, you know, it doesn't matter anymore what lies are told. There used to be a time where you get caught out, and that would, you know, you would end up being punished or whatever, found out and proved wrong, what have you. It doesn't seem to apply at the moment. And again, the Nazis were totally on top of that. You just repeat a lie often enough and people will believe it. And we could, I'm sure there's room for discussion there about recent events in this country, and with Trump as well, you know. So he tells about, I think someone did some research, I mean, thousands of lies in a month, you know, thousands of them, if they clock them. This one, again, if you wish the sympathy of the broad masses, you must tell them the crudest and most stupid things. Well, we had John Major recently. I don't know whether any of you heard his speech recently, saying how, you know, well, we were told we wouldn't have to leave the single market. We have, etc., etc. Simple, crude things which should have been clear were not simple at all, crudely put. And I've just put a few quotes down the bottom about, you know, how crude the statements were. But again, it's a propaganda technique that unfortunately can be very effective. Now, this one, some of you might be acquainted with. Pastor Neumüller was somebody who was persecuted. He wasn't killed, persecuted though by the Nazis. I'm just going to I've got two screens here, which is why I'm doing this. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And there's a little poem in there. I don't know whether you can see it. I wrote a series of haikus over the last few years, and it was 3 million. If the haiku was a Japanese poetry form of 5 syllables, first line, 7 syllables, second line, 5 syllables, last line. 3 million plus disenfranchised overnight, who speaks out for them? And that was all the non-UK EU nationals living here who had the rug pulled from under their feet overnight. And many of them are still living in a state of limbo. They've written a couple of books about it called In Limbo, and how 3 million people could be disenfranchised overnight the way they were. I still can't get my head around that, how that was possible, but it was done. This perhaps is the most, one of the most chilling. Goebbels again, happy smiling Goebbels. There is no point in seeking to convert the intellectuals, for intellectuals would never be converted and would anyway always yield to the stronger. And this will always be the man in the street. Arguments must therefore be crude, clear, and forcible. The truth was unimportant and entirely subordinate to tactics and psychology. Well, haven't we seen that recently? Unabashedly so. It's about, well, what's truth got to do with it? It's about emotion and psychology. So this is another one, accuse the other side of that which you are guilty. we see that going on a lot as well. You just turn it round. So there are a lot of things. Maybe we've had enough for now. If anyone's interested, I can send you more. Just to close, I want to close with a Stolperstein, which are, I've had one, my eldest brother and I had one laid for our grandmother outside her apartment block in the Czech Republic. An artist, a German artist called Gunther Demerung, started this project where they embed these brass plaques. They're about that size in real size, outside the homes of where Jews were deported, even if they survived or if they committed suicide as well, or if they were refugees. And Stolperstein is German for stumbling block. So it's like people stumble over it. I find it a very, very effective reminder, or very effective way of reminding people. We had one for our grandmother, Rosemary Schonfeld. She was deported in 1842, and murdered in Treblinka. Then we had one done for Moritz outside the hospital where he worked, as well, saying their practice, Dr. Moritz Schonfeld, and gives the dates as well. And on that note, that whistle stop tour. I've probably gone on too long. I've tried to be brief. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, any comments, now's the time. And I can't see everyone. So Darren, can you sort of?
I was going to say, Rosemary, if you stop sharing your screen, we should go back to the gallery view. So
yes, absolutely. Stop share. Thank you. Great.
There we go. So if we go,
but I still can only see a few at the time. So
yep, no, I've got everyone there. So Rosemary, thank you ever so much for a fantastic talk. So I've seen the Rob Rinder program just lately, sort of thing. So I knew some of the stuff you were going to be touching upon it tonight, but the research you've done has just blown me away. I'm sure there's loads of questions, so I'd like to open the floor for any questions at all. Yes, Nan, if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay.
I did actually put it on the chat box, but what I was interested in was whether RELLY had retained her Jewish faith.
Yes. Yes. She had, she would, they'd have Shabbat every Friday night. Her family would come round. I think she did go to synagogue sometimes. So, and she did Shabbat. It was really when she lit the candles, and she said it was always sort of for respect for her parents.
Thank you.
Remember her parents.
Thank you.
Any other questions at all? Win, is that a question? Yes, Win.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a question. It's more of a comment, actually, Rosemary. Thanks ever so much. It's so stimulating. It's a subject that really fascinates me. I went to Dachau last year and to Krakow, but I was too upset by Dachau to go to Auschwitz. But, it is extraordinary. But what you see at Dachau and at the Schindler Museum and things like that in Krakow is so much of the story that runs up to, from 1933 and Hitler moving in, and it does fascinate me as to why people were convinced by this propaganda. You've hit it on the nail there. I'm half German. My mother was a German family in Aachen, and I did once ask her, what did you do about Hitler? Because they were a Catholic community and very much against his principles. But why didn't they do anything? Well, they were in fear. They didn't know what to do, and they couldn't do anything. So it's not just being convinced, although I'm sure they probably were brainwashed as well. Because it's so easy to turn people against, hate immigrants or hate anybody that, if someone points, it's very easy to get them to hate. But the psychology and how you turn a nation into something evil like that is just really fascinating, and I'm just so glad you brought it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, I think you've got a question there.
Well, not so much a question as an observation. I'm just horrified how you can bring it so clearly to us, Rosemary, of the consequences of the whole scenario. It seems to be those who speak the loudest are understood and believed. And where are we now in this day and world? You know, we could still be in that situation, because you are, I don't know how the Jews can actually stand up there and say they are Jews now, because they've had such persecution over the years. It's just horrendous. And I think really we are not educating our young people in the same, you know, they seem to believe everything that comes up before them. You know, this is wonderful, that's wonderful, this is it, go for it. You know, it's all, but they should be taught to think beyond what is up there.
Mm.
And I can see in the years ahead, we are going to be in a similar situation to what we have been. And I have many German friends, and I have similar apprehension about their understanding of what we are faced with for the future. So mine is not so much a question, but it's an observation of where do we stand in this world now? Because what you went through, what your parents went through, what your grandparents went through, is there before us now. And it could happen tomorrow. If there's a significant leader there to lead them through the mire of what they're going to come through. I'm just devastated. Thank you. It was a very enlightening talk, and I appreciate your thoughts and how you can persevere to come through it all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope, you know, what's important is that people keep thinking in that way that you're thinking, questioning. It's about questioning and being aware. And I do feel that the education is so key. And I sorry to say, but I think in this country, it's been a little undermined. I mean, young people are not taught to critically think in the way that's necessary to ensure, you know, things don't go down a road like that. But thank you very much.
Yes, I want to make a similar observation. I mean, I'm very, very disturbed by the rise of right-wing politicians on both sides of the Atlantic and similar things, and the fact that simple slogans, you know, 2 or 3 words chanted over and over, persuade people a great deal more than you know, a real philosophical or intellectual explanation or discussion on things. And that's the dangerous thing, because it's not that difficult apparently to whip people up into a frenzy of hatred and resentment and all that type of thing, especially if you tell them that they're great and they're special, which unfortunately that's another part of the propaganda. You know, you're the best, those people are cockroaches or whatever, you know, dehumanizing them, which I know happened under the Nazis, and it has happened in Rwanda, and it's happening in other places.
Oh,
thank you, Dominica. Any further questions or observations before I pass over to Sarah for vote of thanks? Before I pass over to Sarah, I'd just like to pick up. I've had a few comments passed me privately here from people. I know 1 or 2 have got to shoot off in a second, but they've been saying what a fantastic talk this evening. And I think Nan's actually made a very good comment here just before she disappears. She's made a comment here in the chat. There are still those who say it didn't happen, especially the young, which is very scary. And I think we touched upon that just now. So, Sarah, would you like to please give the vote of thanks?
Yes. Well, I think people have already started saying thank you, Rosemary, and I'm sure you can hear the response from people very clearly here. I heard your talk a few months ago and asked if you could come and give the talk here, because I was just very struck by how powerfully you drew the parallels between, you know, something that we think of as happening a long time ago, the Holocaust, as a matter of history, and actually the kind of thinking, the politics, the propaganda is happening now around us. And I really think it's so important to think about these things and be ready in our own way to combat it if peace is to prevail. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said the price of peace is eternal vigilance, I believe. I think that's so true. And thank you for really inspiring us all to be that much more vigilant as to what is going on around us, and telling us about your family history. Thank you very much.
I seem to have a, oh good, there's a problem with the mic. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for coming, and given, you know, the comments from some of you, keep talking about it. I mean, I think that's really important at the moment to even if people sort of roll their eyes or, you know, don't want to admit these things, we just have to keep these issues out there, as you obviously, so many of you are aware. It's quite dangerous sort of at the moment if we are not vigilant. So thank you, Sarah, for getting me invited. Appreciate that.